All right, everybody, welcome, welcome, welcome. So, hi, welcome everyone to tonight's webinar, Fracking Through the Cracks, the Halliburton Loophole and Unregulated Chemicals in Fracking. Streaming to you live from Halt the Harm Network. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know it will take a few minutes for everybody to get in here. And so I'm gonna go ahead and introduce myself and as well, Halt the Harm Network. So my name's Christina DiGiulio, aka PK, as a lot of you know. I'll be helping MC tonight, and along with Kevin Richardson from Halt the Harm Network. And I'm a member of the Halt the Harm Network, and I've been engaged with this community for about, I think, 5-6 years now, which is interesting to think back. It's gone quick, but so all right, my name is Christina Julia. I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself because I'm going to go over and tell you who I am. I'm actually out of Chester County, Pennsylvania. It's the western side of Philadelphia, and I've been organizing around the grassroots, around the harms of fracking infrastructure mainly, and specifically for Watchdogs of Southeastern Pennsylvania, fighting the Mariner East pipeline, which is a pipeline for plastics. And that's about 7 years now that we've been fighting this and continuing to fight it. And as well, I am now working for Physicians for Social Responsibility Pennsylvania. I got a job through being a watchdog. And what I am is a certified thermographer. I am their science consultant, and what we do is try to, help the health of Pennsylvanians through one community at a time. So we're very community based, and so I am also an analytical chemist. I retired from the DoD, so I am so in love with that. I'm going to introduce these two wonderful speakers tonight. I'm really excited to do this, mainly because I have worked with Halt the Harm and recognized in my work that, organizing this without having a network is really hard and difficult. It keeps us isolated and compartmentalized. And what Halt the Harm has helped us do is approach, giving us a network to organize and connecting all these great leaders and providing leaders and grassroots movements, but providing resources, which is what we're going to see tonight. And as well, from my experience, the most difficult aspect of organizing has always been making the connections. And when I am not in, a lot of the NGOs or whatever before, I was just starting as a person from the ground, on the ground, boots on the ground. And I was like so newbie at this. And what Halt the Harm has really done has helped me connect to a lot of other people. And now they're allowing me to host something as an MC. So it's amazing. So tonight we're going to hear two different leaders of a wonderful topic. Again, Halliburton Loophole. As a chemist, I am so in love with this topic because it's true. And the two speakers we have tonight are Vivian Underhill and Allison. So how many people do we got on here now? 53 people. Wow, that's amazing. So, of course, as we said, I want to talk a little bit about the Halt the Harm Network. The network is a place where you can connect with other people fighting the harms of oil and gas infrastructure or pollution. We are a national network of local groups and leaders fighting to protect their communities. And if you're not a member, join the Halt the Harm Network at network.halttheharm.net. And as a member, you can connect with others in the network and access shared resources and campaign support and all of our past event workshops and recordings. And by the way, please go see it, get involved with it. It is an amazing thing. And just from boots on the ground over here, y'all help elevate my voice. So I appreciate that. And I'm going to pass it on to Kevin.
Thank you so much, Chris, BK. It was a great intro. My name is Kevin Richardson. I'm with Halt the Harm Network. I've been involved with them for a couple of years now. I'm also a big proponent of Halt the Harm and the network approach to organizing. I've met so many amazing people through this network. Love it. Love you guys. I dropped information on how to join the network in the chat. So if you're not a member, get on there and join. I'm going to go through our agenda tonight. I'm going to help work with Chris PK on emceeing tonight. So you'll see me here and there. If you have any technical questions or issues that come up, I'm also your technical support tonight. So feel free to send me a message in the chat and I'll answer and help you out with anything you need. But tonight we got a pretty great show going on today. right now we're running through the welcome and introductions, and we're gonna do a quick activity to kind of see where everyone's coming from. After that, we're gonna move into the presentation with Vivian Underhill, and then we're gonna go to do a quick Q&A. While the presentation is going on, I invite everyone to drop their questions in the chat. And when we get to Q&A, we'll go through the questions in the chat. Feel free to ask the speakers anything you like. It's a really great opportunity to learn, so feel free to ask for clarification or points for further discussion. Just drop those in the chat and we'll get to them during the Q&A. After the Q&A, we're really excited because Gary Allison is also here to help demo the OpenFF tool, which is a really great resource for analyzing the chemicals connected to frac wastewater, and it's going to be really useful for folks on the call to use. So we're going to have that at the end after the Q&A, and then we're going to open up to another discussion for folks to talk about the tool, ask questions about it, see getting help with using it, and if folks are interested, we'll likely have a follow-up event, hopefully to talk more about the tool if there's, and so yeah, we'll do that later. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to PK, who's going to introduce our speakers, and then we'll get into tonight's presentation. Thanks everyone for joining us, and I love these events, love being part of Halt the Harm. One of the greatest things we can do is invite folks like Vivian and Gary here to share their knowledge, share their resources, and hopefully it'll be of use to folks on the call tonight. So, oh, and final reminder, we'll also send out the recording of this event via email, likely tomorrow at the latest. So look out for that. If you have any friends who couldn't make it, just forward them that email with the link to the recording. So with that, I'll pass it back to PK to introduce our wonderful speakers for tonight.
Delighted to. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to introduce Gary and Vivian. So we'll start with Vivian. Vivian Underhill is a postdoctoral scholar at Northeastern University with the Social Science Environmental Health Research Institute. Her work is based in community engaged methods to research oil, groundwater, and the environmental justice issues surrounding their extraction in California. She holds a PhD in feminist studies from UC Santa Cruz. Awesome. And then Gary Allison has been interested in large data sets for years, another nerd. I love it. He received his PhD in zoology with an emphasis in marine ecology from Oregon State University in 1997. He is currently cleaning and analyzing marginally public data sets to make them more accessible. He's just started working for FracFocus to make OpenFF more available to researchers, activists, journalists, and community members, which is an amazing purpose to do. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for that intro.
Now on to the speakers.
Well, yeah, thanks for that intro, PK. Now that we know, have sort of met our speakers, we're going to do that quick exercise I talked about with the map tool, just to see where everyone's coming from. And this will be cool because it'll give us a sense of where people are interested in this issue. We can get a sense of some of the regions where the Halliburton Loophole becomes really relevant. So I'm going to go load up here the map. If you've been with us recently, you've probably seen this in some of our introductions, but basically what I'm going to do is share my screen again and pull up a map of the United States. And I'm going to invite everyone here who is present for this presentation to drop their location in the chat. And as you drop your location in the chat, drop your city and your state, or your county and your state, it'll populate it here, and we'll get a sense of where everyone's coming from. So if you go ahead and start doing it, you'll see where we're doing it. So we got folks from Seattle, Colorado, Denver, Michigan, Pennsylvania area, West Virginia, Maryland, San Francisco area, Northern California. A lot of folks from Colorado, a lot of folks from Ohio. That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to scoot out, see if there's anyone in the northern part of, yeah, some folks from Canada. That's great. Los Angeles, Texas and Houston, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. Good collection of people from Northeast as well as from the West. The folks coming from the South. Yeah, if you're just signing in now, just drop your city and state or county and state, and it'll populate on this map, and we'll get a sense of kind of where folks are coming from. Some folks from Virginia, you know, a lot of people from areas where fracking is a major issue. The Colorado area, Texas, Ohio River Valley, We got New Mexico, some more folks from the Northwest and Washington, more Canada folks.
I saw some Vancouver in there.
Yeah, I did. Let's see, let me move it up. Yeah, I think that's where we got. Cool, some more folks from Colorado. Awesome. Yeah, that makes sense. We got a good crowd, good mixture of Northeast and West. I love it. Great. Okay, well, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the screen share. You can keep putting your location in the chat and it'll pop up on the map. Yeah, great. Okay, thanks. So excited for so many people in some very important fracking areas to be here tonight to hear this information. And with that, I'm gonna pass it to Vivian. Go for it. And I'm gonna share your slide deck too.
Great, thank you. Well, hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks to Halt the Harm for bringing us together, to Kevin and Ryan for organizing, and PK for helping moderate. My name is Vivian Underhill. Like PK said, I am a postdoctoral scholar at Northeastern University. I am zooming into you today from Denver, Colorado, which is the traditional homeland of the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations. Gary and I will be speaking to you today about our recent paper. It was published in Environmental Pollution. It's entitled Outcomes of the Halliburton Loophole. And in this paper, we looked at the chemicals that would otherwise be regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act, if not for the Halliburton Loophole, which I will talk about, that were used in fracking from 2014 to 21. So I'm going to talk briefly about our study motivation and our findings, and then Gary will speak a little further about FracFocus and OpenFF and kind of the data and methods side of it. And then I'll return to talk about some of the big things that we found. I know I speak for both of us in saying we're very glad to be speaking with you and really hope that our research can be of use to you all in your organizing and activism. My own work and background, like PK said, it's based in collaboration with environmental justice organizing around oil extraction in California's Kern County. And I want to call out, I saw Rosana Esparza is here on the call. She's been one of my primary collaborators and now a good friend in that work also. So glad to see you there. So I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today. All right, so you can go ahead one slide. Great. So our study motivations first. We wanted to use OpenFF really as a way to produce rigorous analyses within what is often an intentionally data poor landscape, and really see what knowledge we could produce even with the gaps and absences that often really characterize fracking data. We wanted to do so in a way that really addressed the inequities and the risks of fracking in terms of both public health and environmental health. And we wanted to highlight the impacts of the many legislative exemptions that are granted to the oil and gas industry. Next slide. As you all well know, these are things that you as an audience are all very familiar with already. Fracking is a major public health and environmental health issue. According to one study, over 17.6 million Americans now live within a mile of an oil or gas well. And since about 2014, most of those new oil and gas wells have been fracked. Low-income communities and communities of color are disproportionately affected. And as one study recently showed, the siting of these oil and gas wells often relates to the geographies of historic redlining. And yet there are no federal level disclosure or monitoring requirements for fracking. Next slide. This is in part because of a suite of federal exemptions passed over the last few decades. Fracking is exempt from part or all of the following: the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and a range of hazardous waste and community right to know laws like CERCLA, EPCRA, and RCRA. And then, of course, also it's exempted from the Safe Drinking Water Act, which was really our focus. And so on this, I'll point you to, there was a really great study by Earthworks and OGAP, I think in 2007, about kind of summarizing these exemptions if you want to learn more. Next slide. So the Safe Drinking Water Act, which was our focus, it is the US's flagship water quality law, and it's the only legislation that sets out legally binding drinking water standards at the federal level. It also establishes the guidelines for regulating underground injection of chemicals called UIC guidelines, which require monitoring plans, among other protections. Next slide. And many of these things I'm sure you already know, but I'll give kind of the brief context before we move forward. So after extensive lobbying by the oil and gas industry, oil and gas activity was exempted from the Safe Drinking Water Act under the 2005 Energy Policy Act. This provision is often called the Halliburton Loophole because it's named after then Vice President Dick Cheney, who was the former CEO of Halliburton and really championed that lobbying process. So the Halliburton Loophole now means that chemicals whose use would otherwise be regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act are now legally allowed to be injected as part of fracking activity. In addition, oil and gas producers are not required to develop underground injection control plans. They're not required to disclose the contents of fracking fluid, and they're not required to monitor local water sources for contamination under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So about 15 years after the Halliburton Loophole, we set out to really calculate its impacts in aggregate. We wanted to know in what frequency and in what mass were Safe Drinking Water Act chemicals used in fracking, what health effects did they have, and who were the most common users and suppliers of these chemicals. So to do so, we used OpenFF. So I'll turn it over to Gary to talk about that.
Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about the data, and the data, as Vivian said, comes from FracFocus. Next slide, please. And as many of you know, FracFocus is a disclosure database that has close ties to the industry. They call it the National Hydraulic Fracking Chemical Disclosure Registry, a mouthful. It's less of a database and more of a clearinghouse where companies submit disclosures where they list the chemicals that they use in fracking operations. And they've been doing that since 2011 and to the present, where there are about 1,000 new fracking disclosures each month. The data set is full of errors, has a lot of big data gaps, has a lot of trade secret problems where chemicals are hidden. But nevertheless, it's a really important data source because it is the main place where we find chemical disclosures across the United States. There are over 200,000 fracking vents documented there, and that's about 6 million chemical records. Next slide, please. One of the first things you notice when you start working with FracFocus is that when they talk about the quantity of chemicals used, they emphasize percentages of the chemicals within the whole hydraulic fracking fluid. So this pie chart here is from their website, and it illustrates the way that they present the quantity of things. So the blue is the water, about 85% is water. The gray is 14% sand. And that small little red slice is all of the other chemicals that are added into the fracking fluid. So it appears to be a fairly small portion of the whole thing. And if you look at the disclosures individually, you'll see that individual chemicals are listed by their percentage in the overall fracking fluid. So they're often very, very small. OpenFF, the project that I worked on, takes the FracFocus data and calculates the weight of those chemicals too, and you start to get a little bit different picture. Next slide, please. So, for example, in a typical fracking job from 2022, a job used 16 million gallons of water. That works out to be about 130 million pounds of water. And if you do a little bit more math to calculate the whole fracking fluid weight, you end up with that small slice of chemicals actually weighing 1.2 million pounds of added chemicals. That's roughly 30 tractor trailer loads of chemicals. So even though that slice looks very small, it can be quite big when the pie is enormous. So besides the weight of chemicals, FracFocus, OpenFF tries to do some other things. Next slide, please. We try to resolve chemical identity when it is ambiguous in FracFocus. We try to clean up errors and standardize names, all to make it easier to search through the FracFocus data, and so that users can do deeper dives on individual chemicals, on geographic areas, and on companies. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Vivian.
Awesome. So Kevin, you can go to the next slide. So what did we find? What were some of our major findings? Next slide. The first thing that we found is that 28 chemicals that would otherwise be regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act were used in fracking during our study time period, which was 2014 to 2021. So the Venn diagram on the right here shows the overlap of the Safe Drinking Water Act's two different legally binding lists of regulated chemicals. That's the Drinking Water Standards and Health Advisories and the National Primary Drinking Water Regulations, the orange and the yellow circles. And then it shows their overlap with FracFocus chemicals, which is the purple circle, which you can see there are 1,212 individual different chemicals reported in fracking. And so I should say here, this does not imply that all of the chemicals other than the 28 are safe because they're not on these lists. Instead, if a chemical is not on one of the EPA's lists, it's not because it's safe necessarily, but rather EPA has not studied it fully yet, or sometimes at all. Next slide. We also collated information on each chemical in this table. I won't go through it here in detail, but I want to point you to it in case there's any information here that will be helpful in your work. It includes the frequency and the mass of each chemical's use in fracking, their health effects as defined by EPA. That's the critical effects and the systems effects. It shows their MCL, which is the maximum contaminant level, and their RFD, which is a reference dose. Both MCL and RFD are just two different ways of essentially defining chemical limits based on their human health impacts. And then finally, we also included their reportable quantity under CERCLA. So reportable quantities are defined as essentially, they're like a mass threshold value. So any spills of a chemical above that value are required to be reported to emergency personnel. As I mentioned before, fracking is not subject to CERCLA, but we used these reportable quantities because they're essentially another way of showing the relative risks of these chemicals as established by federal environmental health scientists. And they were a way to kind of, for us to compare the masses used to some sense of mass threshold of risk. Next slide. Okay, so these 28 chemicals, they amounted to 282 million pounds. And again, this is 282 million pounds of chemicals that would have been regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act if not for the Halliburton Loophole. So for reference, that's 1.7 times the weight of the Washington Monument, or almost 1.5 times the weight of the largest warship ever built. So this is a very large mass that we're talking about. Next slide. Then we dug a little deeper and we broke that analysis down to look at the different masses of each individual chemical used per year. So just to orient you a little on this figure, you can see each bar here represents 1 year from 2014 to 2021. And then each color represents the mass of a particular chemical used in that year. There's 3 panes because we broke it into large, medium, and small mass chemicals, because essentially the scale of, for instance, ethylene glycol that was used completely swamps out the variations of the smallest mass chemicals. So you can see there's different scales here on the y-axis. So one thing we can see here is there's quite a bit of variability between chemical masses used by year. Though you can definitely tell some things in total quantity. You can definitely see the slump in drilling in 2016. And then you can also see another slump in 2020 and 2021 during COVID. So we're seeing that come back up in 2022 and 2023. You can also see down at the bottom here, this green, that's ethylene glycol, and ethylene glycol was the chemical by far used in the largest masses. It was used in 45% or almost half of all disclosures. And so for some context, ethylene glycol is a main ingredient in antifreeze, along with other kind of industrial uses. It affects the nervous and the urinary systems. So upon exposure to a human, it breaks down into individual compounds within the body that first affect the central nervous system, the heart, and then the kidneys. Then if we move into the middle, the intermediate masses, naphthalene, acrylamide, and formaldehyde were also very common. So we kind of pulled those out in the paper to discuss more. These are the yellow, light orange, and dark orange in the graph. Naphthalene and acrylamide are both possible human carcinogens, and formaldehyde is a known human carcinogen. But there's also a major spike in benzene use that I want to point out. This is down in the bottom pane again, it's the blue. This benzene is mostly in a group of disclosures in Texas from 2019. Benzene is such a potent human carcinogen that the Safe Drinking Water Act limits exposure to 0.001 milligrams per liter, which is equivalent to half a teaspoon of liquid in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. But there were 7.5 million pounds of benzene in total injected during fracking during our study time period. Next slide. And then finally, you will not be surprised to see that Halliburton is in fact the most frequent supplier, not just of fracking fluids, but of these chemicals regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act specifically. So you can see them here, they're above Chemplex, Schlumberger, some other ones are Liberty Oilfield Services or Baker Hughes. Next slide. However, one of the major findings of our paper wasn't even about the Safe Drinking Water Act itself. We also found that the use of trade secrets or proprietary claims, these are used to withhold chemical identities. The use of those trade secrets massively outweighed the reported use of Safe Drinking Water Act chemicals. So as you can see here, the percentage of fracking disclosures using these Safe Drinking Water Act chemicals, that's the blue line. And you can see it's decreasing over our study time period. But the percentage of fracking disclosures that report proprietary claims has steadily increased. It has a minimum of 77% in 2015, up to a maximum of 88% in 2021. And then the numbers above and below the lines, yes, those ones, exactly. They represent the total mass used per year in millions of pounds. So beyond the percentages that are increasing, we can also see that, for instance, in 2021, 1.675 billion pounds of undisclosed proprietary chemicals were injected into the earth for fracking, and we have no way of knowing what those are. So really the problem that we're finding is not constrained to what's regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act only, but also this very widespread use of trade secret claims, which in most states don't require approval or even defense like something like a patent would. Next slide. Okay, so why does this matter? For many reasons. For us, one of the big things we wanted to highlight was the lack of monitoring, both in terms of these large amounts of proprietary claims, like I said, but also these exemptions from federal environmental legislation. This lack of monitoring makes it really hard to understand how these chemicals are moving in the environment or to do more in-depth exposure or toxicological assessments. Many of you have probably, like the EPA, for instance, in their 2016 report said something like many data gaps prevent further analysis. Similar in California, there was a report that said, well, we don't find evidence of these harms, but part of the problem is it's extremely hard to find this causal evidence in the first place because of these exemptions. So this is why we began with kind of a basic aggregate analysis to then support future studies. We also wanted to really highlight the scale of the problem and highlight how exceptional the oil and gas industry is among other industries. It really it's one of the only industries that has these blanket exemptions from the very legislation that's meant to protect water quality and human health. And that's particularly important knowing how potentially toxic these chemicals can be. So putting the mass of these chemicals used next to their potential toxicity really hopefully starts to open up that conversation. So in our recommendations in the paper, we suggest that Congress close the Halliburton loophole, of course, and other exemptions from federal legislation. And we also suggest that they mandate a much more comprehensive set of disclosure requirements. But we're also hoping that these results can support your locally based work as well, and might suggest other important steps forward in addition. So the next slide is our citations. And I will pause there so we can have some questions and a discussion.
Cool, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. We're going to get into the Q&A in just a second. And so while folks are thinking of questions, we're going to, again, put them in the chat. While folks are thinking about questions, we do want to hear from you guys really quickly, because that was a lot of really good information. And I think a lot of really useful and some of it enraging kind of details about how this loophole is preventing us from understanding exactly what's happening with the chemicals. And part of that presentation, Gary introduced the OpenFF tool that kind of allows us to kind of get into the disclosures database and actually see what chemicals are out there. So I wanted to take a moment and hear from y'all, since a lot of folks on this call are involved in advocacy around fracking or supporting advocacy around fracking. I really want to hear how y'all think you would be able to use that database. So I'm going to put a question in the chat right now. And that question is, what kind of questions can you imagine asking or answering with the OpenFF tool? Again, that's the tool that lets you go through the disclosure database, and what would be useful for you and if you're involved in your organization. So I'm going to put that question in the chat. If y'all can take a second and just put some answers in the chat. I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm just going to show folks answers to this question pop up on the chat. Let's see. And let me do a quick screen share. So here we go. There we go. Honestly, I know fracking is bad. Thank you for the OpenFF resource. This is called it's called transient stream. So when you put stuff in the chat, it will pop it up here. So again, what do you think? What kind of questions can you imagine asking or answering with the OpenFF tool, and how would that be useful to you in your organization, your advocacy, your community, and stuff like that? Yeah, people are looking for policy recommendations at the federal and state level. That's pretty dope. Radioactive data from fracking, for gas certification to point out the lack of upstream impact assessments. Do certain companies use particular chemicals? Yeah, that's precisely, I think, the use that, and Gary will talk about more when he demos it towards the end of the event today. Stuff, yeah. Does any of your data translate production to greenhouse gas emissions? Is that data available elsewhere? This data focuses mostly on the chemicals involved in the disclosures, what's going into, especially into water sources or near water sources. So a lot of this is focused on that kind of level of toxicity. Include waste products. So again, yeah, it looks at the chemicals. Wells. That's for sure. Cool. Radioactivity track through this app. We can let Gary answer that question. We get the Q&A. That's gonna say. I don't think it deals directly with T-Norm, but yeah. Yeah, finding the chemical companies working in the community or releasing across the country. Yeah, so this is a really good point, thinking about, tracking down not just the people involved in fracking, but the chemical companies that are supplying it. And Vivian had a great graph showing Halliburton was one of the biggest suppliers. Excellent. Okay, I'm gonna, that was really good. It was great to hear how people think they might use this tool. And I'll just do a quick reminder of where we're at in our agenda. We just had this wonderful presentation. We're going to spend about 10 to 15 minutes doing open Q&A, and drop your questions in the chat. PK is going to lead us through the Q&A, and Vivian and Gary will answer your questions. Then once that's the Q&A is over, we're going to start Gary's going to do about a 10-minute demonstration of how to use the OpenFF tool. And I encourage folks to stick around for that. If you have to drop off, that's totally cool too, but it's a good chance to see how it works. He'll run us through how to look up sort of the chemical databases, see what companies are behind it and so forth. And then we'll have a short discussion about the tool itself. So with that, I'll pass it to PK and we can start this Q&A and let's hear what folks' questions are.
So I'm going to start from the beginning with Peggy, and I believe Peggy was asking what can be done to close the loophole. I know everybody's going to ask that, so if any of you two want to take that one.
I mean, that's a huge question. And that's part of why we wanted to actually speak with you all today. You know, I think from our perspective, one of the things that could be done was to kind of almost quantify or give some of the dimensions of what has been the chemical impact of the Halliburton loophole thus far, hoping that that analysis would then become useful to push for policy change at various levels. So that's one small piece of it. But I really think that in a network like this, I'm hoping we can have a much broader discussion about what are some modes of organizing and working together to make that happen. Maybe we could come back to that question at the very end and open it up.
Yeah, absolutely. And Garrett, anything to say, or do you want to hold off?
Nothing to add to that.
Great. All right. So Carlito, I see here, is asking where can I get a copy? If you could clarify what that means. I'm not sure because we're going back. I'll skip over my questions for the night. I'm going to go. Has there been increasing withholding with more use of the systems approach on FF?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something that we're looking at trying to quantify
Right now.
Yeah, right now. Part of the issue is it's disclosures as they come through. Well, maybe I should back up. There are two different ways of entering data that companies have into the Frac Focus, and one of them is called the systems approach, which essentially disconnects the chemicals from the products and the companies. And the idea, the hope that when it was pushed was that if they disconnected the chemicals from the companies, the people wouldn't be able to tell what trade secrets were connected to what products. It turns out that from what we can tell, that's had no effect, but it's had the detrimental effect of keeping us from seeing which chemicals are used in which products. So it's not a great thing. So I think the short answer though is it looks like the proprietary chemicals are not hurt by the systems approach. They're still being used a lot.
And I can add for anyone who's interested, there's a paper that came out last year or the year before. It's by Kevin Trickey. I'll track down the PDF, but they were looking at this exact question, and they found at first when the systems approach was put in place, it seemed like proprietary withholding would decrease. But then by the end of the study time period, which I think was 2020, systems approach disclosures actually had more proprietary claims than non-systems approach disclosures. So it does seem like the promise of the systems approach is not coming to fruition without also a ban on proprietary withholding altogether.
That makes a lot of sense. It's kind of scary as a chemist. I'm going to go with my questions sort of here, which is do they even have data to show, the impact on health or human aspects of putting more than two chemicals together? If you don't, especially when you have proprietary, we don't even know what they're made of. It's really hard for people to understand. They have a lot of data on the two chemicals and how they interact and what they could do in your body. But when it comes to 2, 3, and when we have a whole accumulation, it's not addressing that. It's pretty scary when you just stated that knowing proprietary doesn't.
Yeah. Not to mention that those chemicals are being mixed underground at very high pressures, and that's likely to give you a lot more other crazy things.
Way outside of what they've studied. Another question here. We have 2 questions from Heidi. Is the reporting in FF voluntary, and could some of the chemicals reported as proprietary actually be SWA chemicals?
So answer to the second one, yes, that's one of our concerns, is that as more attention has come about the Halliburton loophole and the use of these safe drinking water chemicals, that companies could still be using them, but just disclosing them as proprietary rather than the actual chemical name. And in fact, that graph that shows increasing percentage of proprietary claims, decreasing percentage of Safe Drinking Water Act chemicals, kind of that opens the question to that exact point. In almost all states, reporting to FracFocus is voluntary. As far as I know, California is the only one that requires disclosure of every single chemical used. Maybe Gary, you can say more about that, but for the most part, it's voluntary.
I think that many states require some disclosure, often directly to FracFocus, sometimes to state level databases, but I think many companies find it easier just to submit to FracFocus. And so I think when I've looked at the number of disclosures that are showing up in FracFocus compared to state, it's often almost all of the disclosures are showing up in FracFocus compared to what's also in the state databases. Okay.
And so Bill Lyons is asking, is there a reason you look at the weight of the chemicals instead of the volume? And he said, I assume some of the chemicals are liquid.
Yeah, the bottom line is that the data we have are for the mass. There's no data on the volume used, and often these chemicals are, when it comes to like EPA limits and things like that, they're often by pounds, by how much they weigh. There's no information in FracFocus about the volume used, even though that some of the chemicals would be liquids.
No, thank you for that answer. And Peggy's saying, outrageous. Can we send this data or a link to the disclosures and ask our state and local officials to go to gas and oil and demand a list of undisclosed chemicals?
Yes, please. I think that's a great idea. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. I think one of the issues is that many of the rules around disclosure have written into it that trade secrets are exempt from being disclosed, and that through most of the state laws that I've seen, they're written into the law. So I think that's the big difficulty.
So Brian was asking, does the benzene spike indicate some hidden spikes? I'm not sure what that means. If you want to clarify, Brian, but you guys might. I mean, I kind of understand, but
yeah, it's an interesting thing that those benzene disclosures showed up in a small area in Texas, and what they were related to some disclosures where they actually disclosed the chemicals that were in produced water that was injected in. Often they don't disclose what's in produced water, they just call it water. And I think that's part of what's going on, is that when they actually look at what's in the produced water, they see a lot of things, and when perhaps they did some chemical analysis and they just included it in the disclosures.
we know that very well here in Pennsylvania with the produced water and the language they use. It is brine and it's radioactive and it's got all the chemicals with it. So yeah, I get it. The language chase is funny. So why can't state regulatory agencies step up to require some or more disclosure, especially since it will be state and local people who would respond to a release? I'm assuming they're meaning emergency responders and whatnot, you know?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's a great question, and hopefully this is something that this data can push toward. I know that there are some states where, at various levels of government, there are some slow actions to try to both reduce proprietary claims and also increase disclosure altogether, but it is slow and really state by state, or county by county, region by region. I also wanted to say something briefly about the produced water, which is that if, as Gary is saying, which I think is our best hypothesis, that the benzene is showing up because in this particular case, they did some kind of some chemistry on to characterize the produced water itself. This also points to the problem of using produced water for other, quote, beneficial purposes. And especially in California, where most of my work is, Rosanna and I have talked about this a lot. The oil industry likes to say, oh, look, we're producing water for you as well as oil. And in California, this produced water is being used for crop irrigation, as well as dust suppression and many other uses, which means any of the kind of components that are within that produced water are then also kind of spread through the environment via those, quote, beneficial uses. And so I think that's a implication of that benzene spike that's quite important.
That's a really good point. Thank you so much. Definitely seen they use it even for pool salts. Like they, they've got a lot, it's basically when I love what you guys are saying, and you're dealing with the Clean Water Act, and also it's dealing with RCRA, which is like dealing with the cradle to grave aspect, which they're completely exempt from. So if they don't have to identify it, and I think somebody was trying to say like an emergency responder, and you have a tanker truck that doesn't have any placards, how does an emergency responder know how to respond locally? And so I absolutely agree with that. States and local municipalities can start fighting in their own ways to say like, this is not safe for our community, because if a tanker truck rolls over in our area, how do our emergency responders know how to clean it up if they have no indication of what is in that? So this is danger. So can you speak to radioactivity and fracking from Amy?
No. The data set is just what they are putting into the hydraulic fracking fluid, and we don't have any information in FracFocus, at least, about what's coming back out in the produced water.
And there are a lot of studies that people are doing out there. If anybody wants to link some of those studies about radioactive, because they're, at least here in Marcellus Shale, it's one of the most radioactive shales, and it comes up because they're actually going down and bringing up radioactivity and bringing death to the surface. So it's kind of weird. But that's a good question. And I think this is an awesome question from Marty. How has the industry responded to your work? Anything you can share with others on what to expect when leveraging it?
Great question. The only response that we've gotten so far, there was a Inside Climate News article that came out a couple of days ago that asked, I think, both Halliburton and the American Petroleum API, whatever the I is, for comment. They both said no comment. So that's all I can tell you. We haven't gotten a lot of specific responses thus far.
Wow, I'm sure you will. It means good now. This is why we spread our voice. Have you connected this work to setback policy advocacy? And do you know folks who would love to get in contact? That's an interesting question, actually.
The people who I know who are most kick ass about setback policy are actually the EJ organizers in Kern County. They got a setback in Arvin, which is a small town in California in the center of oil country. And that actually propelled then a larger statewide setback ordinance. I personally have not connected this work to setback organizing, but I think it absolutely could be done, really going from the health effects, the masses. I think there's a lot there to work with. But yeah.
Especially when you're talking about that benzene aspect, So that's a great question. I know in California, you guys have had some success in setbacks, a little bit more than we have, I believe. So good work. And I believe is there any questions that I have missed out here? There's a lot.
It's like we got through most of them. If folks have other questions, you can drop them in the chat. I'm going to put a link to the event page on Halt the Harm Network and invite everyone there to share your reactions to the Halliburton Loophole problem, how it affects you, and any additional questions. It's on the network. If you're not a member of Halt the Harm, you can, when you open that page, there'll be a button right in the top right corner to join, and I encourage you to join and tell us your reactions and any additional questions people have.
I did miss one.
Yeah, but yeah, which one did you miss?
Yeah, I mean, it says salary wrappers. I apologize. Is there a state law that might be one to follow for best practice? Is there proposed legislation for best practice that we could see? That's a really good question, actually. Or anybody who could answer that.
Right. Yeah, maybe other people can answer that.
This is why we're doing this work. Exactly why. Great questions. All right.
Great. Yeah, I don't know of any particular laws in the states that are good models, but if anyone has any, please share it in the chat, or you can post it also in Halt the Harm, and I can send it out with the email with the recording so people can get that answer. And yeah, now we have a few minutes left, and we're going to transition. As I mentioned before, one of the things we talked about in the presentation was this awesome tool called OpenFF, which tries to make the Frac Focus industry database accessible and usable to folks who are fighting these chemicals that might be affecting the local drinking supply or the local community. So we're going to pass it to Gary, who's going to spend a few minutes demoing how to use that tool, and then we'll answer folks' questions about that tool. But this is a really great way to apply what we learned today. So Gary, go for it.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to do a quick overview of the browser. This is just a way to get at the data without downloading data and looking at it. You can use the chemical index, which lets you do a deep dive into individual chemicals. And there are 1,300 of them or so that you can look more closely at. There you can do state summaries and see what's going on, what the active companies are, what some different patterns are in the different states, and you can look at different companies and see what kinds of where they operate, where they are active, what years they're active, and things like that. But what I really wanted to spend time on was because I think that many of you are going to be interested in the local effects of fracking. And so what I'm going to do is show a quick demo. This is a tool that I'm working on now. For the most part, we've been thinking about really big picture things across all states, all companies. But I think that a lot of you would be really interested in smaller scale things. And so what I'm going to do is pick one point, and it's going to be a school in Texas, and look at the fracking effects, the chemicals released right around that point. So we're going to pick this school, Barbara Yarborough Elementary School, in just outside of Midland, Texas. We use this tool to get the latitude, longitude of that, and then we just make sure that that's our right place. There's the school, and it's surrounded by a housing complex. We move down farther. We then use that point to query OpenFF for all of the fracking disclosures within a mile radius of that school, and we end up with this picture where we see that the school in the middle with all these, it's 29 different wells nearby. And you might guess too that if we look at the satellite view, you can see all the well pads nearby and even close to the school. Moving from there, we can get the well information. So we see that there are 4 different companies involved in that. It ranged from 2012 to 2018. We can look at how big the fracking jobs are. So in the early years, it's around 1 million gallons, but in the later years, it's anywhere between 10 and about 20 million gallons. So relatively big. But the crux of this OpenFF is to get us to the actual chemicals. And what you're going to see is this table of all the different chemicals that are used in that circle around the school. I've got them sorted based on the weight. So the first column here is just the different chemicals. So water is going to show up first because it's the most used. The number here is just the CAS registration number. It's the ID of the chemical. And there are 59 different records. We could only have 49 records when we can extract mass, but even then it was 2.5 billion pounds of water. The other chemicals used here, the second one is sand at 345 million pounds. The third one is hydrochloric acid at 6 million pounds. And then the fourth one is the proprietary chemicals. So even though there are 280 records here, we don't know what any of them are. They aren't probably the same chemical. They're a mix of them, but there's 2 million pounds of them. And as we go through this list, there are over 90 different chemicals here. We get down to some chemicals that have very small use. So maybe one time and at 3 pounds. So there ranges from very heavy use to very light use. And there are even some that we can't calculate any mass at all. But that brings up the question, how do you find in all of these chemicals, how do you focus on the ones that might be hazardous? And the way that you can do that, you can start to do that at least, is focus on lists of chemicals of concern. And that's what we did in the paper, where we looked at the Safe Drinking Water Act. And if we look at that list, we filter by that list, we start to see that there's 7 different chemicals from the Safe Drinking Water Act. The biggest one being naphthalene at about 9,000 pounds. And the second one is that ethylene glycol that Vivian mentioned at about 5,000 pounds. You could also look at the Clean Water Act, and we see that hydrochloric acid is, of course, the biggest one there, and there are a number of them down to there are 13 of them. So, as Vivian mentioned before, you might think that, well, if there's no list mentioned in these cells, maybe that means that they're safe, but that's not true at all. That a large proportion of the chemicals used in FracFocus, disclosed in FracFocus, haven't been studied well at all, and we're working on tools to show when that occurs, so that we can say that these are unknowns. And I think that's a pretty important point. And I think I'm going to stop there and let's open it up so we can get some questions about how you might use that and how we can help build tools to get the data to you.
Let's see. Wow, there's a lot of comments. Definitely. Department. Amy from the Department of Dumb Question. Okay, no. I can't say that. I can't say it. It's not even compassionate communication. Like, why are these chemicals necessary for fracking? I mean, it's not specific to what you're saying. I mean, I can say it, that every single time they use something like for their drill bit or whatever, they're going from different bedrock to different bedrock. They have to change the viscosity of it. They have to have additives for like antifreeze, for biocides, which is like killing bacteria, supposedly. There's so many lubricants, mainly lubricants, like PFAS, which is so they're using cheap methods, and I don't know why they have to have a proprietary thing. But with fracking, it's different than like horizontal directional drilling, which they do through groundwater. They do through our like lower level, our upper levels of our bedrock. And so they're only allowed to use aqueous, which is water-based chemicals, not the petroleum-based, which is like why fracking can go down a mile. And they're like, yeah, it's fine, just use chemicals. So that's their answers. But as per to what we're talking about, which state has the best disclosure requirements?
I can answer that. I also wanted to point out that OpenFF has a cool tab called Purpose, where you can actually, maybe it's easy to show it right now, Gary, but you can look at the different purposes that individual chemicals, that they've said this individual chemical is used for this purpose. I mean, not a dumb question at all. It's actually very complicated, but it can be very useful to look at what they're saying the purpose might be. I
agree with you.
And yeah, I don't know, Gary, if you want to show that.
I actually don't have an easy way to show that.
Okay.
Then no, but it exists and you can get
You're saying it is actually on there and we can find it if we're playing around with it. Okay. So purpose, look for purpose, everybody.
In terms of the best, California has a set of disclosure requirements that are better than most other states. I would say there are definitely still some drawbacks, but like I said, it's one of the only states that requires that all chemical constituents be reported. Even if the supplier believes it's a trade secret, they still have to report it to the state agency. And then they have a disclosure website that essentially, we were talking about the systems approach before, it essentially disconnects the chemical constituents that were used from the additives, their trade names, and who supplied them. So it's a way of essentially saying, you can still report to us all the chemical constituents, which is what we need for emergency personnel or public health study, without giving up your trade secret status. So it's, I think it offers an avenue. There are still major concerns with data accessibility within that disclosure system. So it's not perfect by any means, and there's a lot that needs to be done to make it more transparent and more accessible, but it's one step to perhaps follow.
Absolutely. I have my own question, if it's okay. I did read you guys' report. Now I found out it is the real report. And I was looking at, like, for example, in Pennsylvania, I think it was Pennsylvania, one of your charts. It was basically the companies that have disclosed. It didn't have to be specific to Pennsylvania. Obviously, it's like you're looking at everybody, but it's interesting because like EQT was on there in the top. So it's top 20 something you had. And we here in Pennsylvania have Antero, EQT, and then Range Resources, which was not even on what you guys reported, which is like the bottom layer. And that's a major like fracker here. And so if they're not reporting, that's quite scary for people, for example, in Southwestern Pennsylvania, who have been dealing with this, that they're not disclosing these chemicals. And there's probably a good reason for that. And as you said, data accessibility is critical to that. So I appreciate all that information. It kind of, for my question, it would be, is there any work being done to, and like, how is it that these companies are disclosing? Like, is there any work being done to like pressure, and how can we help pressure these companies to do that, or to actually disclose? That's, I mean, because I would like to know what Range Resources is doing.
Range Resources is disclosing, and they have a lot of disclosures in there. They might not have made it into that chart because the other companies just did a lot more. But in terms of influencing the companies, it's interesting. I think one of the issues is with these disclosure instruments, the idea is the public has to give some feedback on what's going into the ground. And when it was just FracFocus, it was hard to get information to even give any kind of feedback. With the papers like that Vivian talked about, and other ones that are coming out, that we can start giving them feedback, and some feedback might be just noting to the companies that we're starting to see mistakes in their disclosures, and that happens often in FracFocus. I've been trying to contact companies, and sometimes that it doesn't get very far. But I think that for them to hear from the public that we're watching is important.
Okay. And thank you so much for saying that, because we all have to, it's a toxic system that we're fighting, and all of this great information and having these tools and resources is a gigantic help. Just like Frac Tracker has done a great job with their mapping. It's helped a lot of us, that are kind of lost. How do we bring all the data together? So I really appreciate that you're trying to and I saw they're using Python. So that's really great, because the capabilities are, it's putting pressure on that. I thank you so much, Gary, for putting the pressure, and Vivian for putting the pressure on this, and saying like, this is a great tool. If we can improve it, it'll be easier for people to look into. And that's really what stops people, I think, is like the complication of it. So
Yeah, if I can just add too that for anybody that thinks that they might use the data but haven't any idea how to even get started, please just contact me, leave a question in the comments, or just directly email me, and I'm happy to help. We're looking to make tools to make it easier for you, but until we have those tools, I'm happy to, talk on the phone, do one-on-one Zooms, things like that. Vivian and I could talk together with you about the kinds of uses that you might use for these data. We're open to helping out. So I hope that you'll contact us about that.
I'm going to contact you, by the way. I just thank you for Halt the Harm hooking me up with you guys. But the reason being is, as an analytical chemist, we're testing for water. If you do not know what to look for in that water, how do you? And I used to modify EPA analytical methods for explosives for the government, so that tells you that they didn't have things that they have buried in the ground. And so I know if you have to modify something, that means there's not an existing standard or a method that's been validated. And for me, when you're working with a proprietary information, you need research. You kind of need forensic people to kind of find that, and nobody's doing that when you're sending your water away to a lab. So it's very scary. This is really good work, and we have to call this out so that people can actually test their water with confidence and know that they're looking for the right stuff. So I really appreciate your work as a chemist.
Glad to hear.
All right, Richard. Kevin Richardson. Gosh.
Okay, people have been doing that for my entire life. It's pretty common. Thank you guys so much for the presentation. That was wonderful. If there is sufficient interest, and I think there is, in seeing more about the OpenFF tool, Halt the Harm is happy to host a workshop with some folks who would like to dig deeper into it and maybe test around and play with it. So if you're interested in that, yeah, let us know in the chat, or send us a note on the network, or feel free to email me for applying to the promotional emails for this, and we'll get that scheduled. Yeah, thank you all so much. Big thanks to Chris PK for emceeing tonight. That was awesome. We have some really wonderful leaders in Halt the Harm network, and we love how involved folks are with the network, and we love what we get out of it, and we're happy to share these resources and connect folks in the community, connect people to folks like Vivian and Gary. And so yeah, super thanks for hosting. Vivian, thanks for the presentation. Gary, thanks for the presentation, for demoing the tool. That was awesome. If you have any follow-up questions, please post them on the network, and we'll get them to Vivian and Gary, or you can reach out to them too. We'll post their contact information on the event page as well. And yeah, thanks y'all so much. We learned a lot tonight, and I really appreciate everyone participating.
And I'd love to say something for just as the outsider. I mean, I do not work for Halt the Harm, but I'm going to tell you what, right now, like the one way that we share as a network, and, we're always dealing with an industry that isolates, compartmentalizes, and kind of attacks communities. And one of the best ways that we can combat that is play their game against them. And so this is why I love Halt the Harm. It's bringing people together and talking about, I love the scientific community. I love the organizer community, the EJ, everything that, we need to do in the system is like amazing. And so, try to stop us. Like, good luck. Good luck. So this is why I thank Halt the Harm for giving us the ability to do this and letting me speak, which is interesting. And like bringing people like Vivian and Gary out here, and like, now I've got a wonderful connection. I'm definitely going to be talking to them. So I absolutely encourage you to reach out to, these people who are putting their life work into something like this. It's their heart and soul is into this. So, we all respect that, right? Thank you, Halt the Harm, by the way.
Thank you.
Thank you, PK. I love it. Thanks so much for your energy tonight. Thanks everyone for joining us. That was awesome. We'll be in touch. We'll see you at the next webinar. Everyone have a great rest of your night. Bye, y'all.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Thank you.